Hello, and welcome to The Blank Potato. This horror story is uploaded by Reddit user bubblesthshark. If you want to learn more about the author, link in the description. The title of this next story is The Red VHS Tape, Part 3. Before we start, I would just like to invite you to please like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and click that notification bell so you won't miss any of my future uploads. So, get comfy, and let's begin. I backed away. I darted my rifle that rested on the moose print patterns of the bed. As the relentless pounding got heavier and heavier, and the hinges vibrated and weakened, I aimed the barrel straight at the center, waiting for the man in the mask to appear. Then, I realized if I was going to make it out, I had to keep the evidence. I couldn't let it disappear again. Only the footage would make the state troopers take me seriously. I pocketed the USB drive just as the sound of shattering, cracking wood filled the room. Only for a moment, I saw a sledgehammer head being pulled from a freshly made hole in the door. Then, I saw the man in the wooden mask look through and wave, tauntingly and menacingly cheerful. I tried to yell, to stand my ground, but my voice wouldn't catch. He reached his arm through the hole where the handle had been and undid the deadlock and chain. Still, I stood frozen, gun held high, but too in shock to fire. He opened the door and stepped inside. His massive figure was accentuated by a thick brown coat and heavy steel toe boots. In his hand, he dragged the long wooden shaft of an old, rusty sledge. "I will shoot," I managed. "Shoot me," he said, his voice completely calm, steady unlike mine. And though I had the better weapon, though the situation seemed in my favor, I felt utterly powerless. It was the demon who haunted my childhood now back and in the flesh, my own personal boogeyman ready to finish the dead. "Shoot me," he yelled, as he swung the great hammer directly into the box television, which shattered glass all around. Electric sparks danced momentarily. Then came the deafening crack of my rifle. Cotton feathers floated through the air. I took my chance to run past him, nearly being knocked down as he shoulder checked me. Quickly down the rusted stairs, I got to my Ranger, but my last bit of hope drained away as I saw the tires. They were slashed completely through. No chance of driving. "That was a clever trick with the tape," he said, slowly making his way down the creaking iron steps. "I underestimated you." I didn't respond except to chamber another round and send it straight to his chest. He stumbled for only a moment, but I took the chance and ran into the woods, nearly tripping on the evergreen roots and upturned mossy stones, but never slowing for fear of the man in the wooden mask. I ran and I ran until finally the adrenaline failed to keep my legs from holding. They failed and I fell, gasping with lungs on fire and legs to match. On the damp, mossy ground of the forest, with rays of sunset beams leaking through the pines, I laid. I caught my breath. The whole time I prayed not to have a sledge come down into my skull. I had no willpower left to stop it. But nothing ever happened. For the moment, I was safe. The sun retreated from the sky, and soon darkness surrounded me. As I finally regained the energy to stand, I reached for my pocket to grab my phone and... "Damn it!" I screamed. As the yell echoed through the woods, I realized my error. Please don't let him be near, I thought. He must not have been, because I survived the night. I slogged through the woods, trying to find my way, but not wanting to go deeper into the vast Alaskan wilderness. Eventually, as the last glimpses of daylight disappeared from the forest, I settled down under a lone Sitka spruce. I rested, thankful that the night was warm at least, and despite my best efforts, despite my desperation and horror, I slowly slipped away to sleep. The songs of the birds woke me. I rubbed my eyes as the morning sun warmed my face. That same eastern sun I used to retrace my tracks, to navigate my way to a road that, thankfully, I recognized. I followed it, but not in the open, keeping it just in view as I hiked through the trees, worried the man might take the highway in search of me. I wandered, but I never saw him. As my worry for my own safety began to lessen, my worry for that of my grandparents grew. My gut pained with the thought of what I might come across when I arrived. How slowly I traveled, how much time the man had to get to them before I. My regret that I hadn't informed them sooner deepened. They had absolutely no idea who was out there. I prayed that Thomas and Isabel might have called in my stead when I failed to answer their messages for so many hours. Then, finally, I saw the familiar scattered houses of my grandparents' small neighborhood. At nearly noon, I snuck my way through, holding my gun ready and looking constantly behind my back, through the yard where I used to play, and up to the rear door of the home. I was greeted with a shotgun pointed at my face, one that lowered just as quickly as it was raised. It was Thomas. "Where have you been? We thought you were dead. We thought..." He was interrupted by his sister, who pushed him aside to embrace me. "Thank God you're okay," said Isabel. They told me about how they immediately booked flights from Seattle when I failed to answer them, how they called Grandma when they landed and filled her in on everything they knew. They led me into the kitchen and then to the dining room. There, I found both of my grandparents, their faces lit up as I entered. My grandmother hugged me and tripped over her well-meaning words. My grandpa, who was bound to his chair, simply said, "Thank God, thank God." He looked old beyond his age, though my grandmother still retained some of the deep amber locks of her youth among the grays. My grandfather's head was pure snowy white. His large and bulky frame barely fit into his wheelchair. My grandmother grabbed me food and a drink to ease my hunger. As she did, I filled them in on what had happened, every detail. And when I got to the topic of the USB, my grandfather's face darkened. "He said my name, didn't he?" I nodded. I asked what the man wanted, but my grandpa only looked down at his rough and withered hands. Eventually, he said to his wife, "We have to tell them." "We do not," defied my grandmother as she rested a plate of maple bacon and golden hash browns in front of me. "What we have to do is get them on a flight to Seattle. They shouldn't have come up to begin with. We'll send the other one with. It's not safe for any of them." "Like we're just gonna stay behind while all this is happening?" interjected Tom. "It's none of your business," Grandma demanded. She washed her hands in the sink and rubbed them dry on her apron. "Like hell it isn't," I retorted. "I've got 2 missing rounds that would beg to differ. We have to know what's going on." She did not respond as she made her way to sit at a table next to my grandfather. He placed his large bare paw on her hand, a comforting gesture as it rested on the table. "Fine," she said, pulling it away. "Even though you promised me you'd never speak of it." "Circumstances, darling." Grandpa took another sip of his drink, looked each of us in the eyes in turn. Then he said carefully, "I'm not who you think I am." We listened intently, myself as I filled my empty stomach, and Thomas and Isabel as they stood by the wall. He told us so many things, so many incriminating things about who he was, what he did for work, about an illegal smuggling operation during the Cold War, how he worked with Soviets just across the Bering Sea to provide them with contraband that could only be found in the US. "It was very lucrative," he continued, "and I didn't feel any guilt. It wasn't anything illegal here. It was movies and food, things the government in Russia didn't allow at the time. I sold it to them, and they turned around and sold it to the citizens. Everything was good, life was good, and for the first time, I could provide for my children. You have to understand, I was a young man, A foolish man, perhaps, but I felt that I was doing good in a way. I justified it not just with the prospering of my family, the buying of this home, but with how the citizens of another nation, one who didn't allow them hardly any freedom, could benefit as well. Then the wall fell. Then the USSR fell. The trade had to change. The same old contraband wasn't enough. I saw his eyes sink into his coffee. I saw his lip begin to quiver. Drugs. I wasn't proud of it, but I did it. I wanted to keep providing for my family, for your father, he said to Thomas and Isabel. And your... But he couldn't finish the sentence. My mother, I choked. We both sat solemnly. We both understood the implications, the unintended consequences of his actions. It was too late to turn back when I found out. When I discovered your mother's addiction, an addiction I caused. My grandmother stood behind him and put her arms across his shoulders. She ran them back and forth to soothe him. It was our greatest mistake, she said. As she kissed his white hair, she added, I blame myself too. I raised her, my grandfather continued, as tears began to build. And I didn't see the signs. I should have never brought those damn drugs through here. Falling droplets hit the table. He managed to choke out. I killed my only daughter, before he convulsed into a sobbing fit. He broke down. Isabel placed her hand gently on my shoulder, but I did not react. As I watched my grandfather relive his greatest regret, as I watched the once powerful, jolly man who raised me, now an aged, crippled mourner. My mind couldn't take anything in. It couldn't understand the revelations presented to me. Was my mother's death really the cause of my grandparents, the ones I had loved my whole life? I suddenly felt sick that I had resented her actions and her leaving me. Once he steadied himself and returned to his typical stoic demeanor, though one decorated with puffy red eyes, we continued. For some time, we discussed it. I scraped at the empty ceramic of the plate, busying my hands. I asked the questions as they answered. But by the end of the conversation, I still had no closure. How does any of this relate to the man in the wooden mask? I asked. Okay, Hot Nick, my grandfather said. The hunter. The name hung in the air after he spoke it. He's the last one, he continued. My grandmother excused herself and went into another room. After I found out about your mother's disease, I tried to fix it. We sent her to rehabilitation. We took you in, and I tried to get out of the game. Well, the boys across the sea didn't like that so much. About 6 months after I stopped flying things over, they sent the hunter for me. Not to kill me, but to send a message. That's why he came to the house, said Thomas. No, that's not why. My grandmother re-entered the room. She had in her hands an old rolled-up newspaper. I had to end it. It had to be done. Spread out over the stained mahogany tabletop, I read the words. 13 Russian nationals dead after warehouse explosion. Damn, Thomas muttered. That was the only word spoken for a moment as we took in this new information. Then Isabel broke the silence. I'm guessing Mask Face didn't like this whole crew going up in flames? Grandpa shook his head. That's when he tried to go after you three. I took his family. He'd take mine. But he didn't get to you. Maybe if he wasn't such a drama queen and just... I don't like to think about what could have happened. The risk I put my loved ones through. So that's why he recorded it all? Just to be dramatic? Thomas asked. I think he intended on filming it all, to the end, and showing me the result. The grim revelation once again muted the room. But then why give up? I continued. Why only return after 19 years? Grandpa took a sip from his coffee mug. Because I put him away. 15 years incarceration. I should have killed him. But I couldn't manage it. That's 15, Isabel said. Why wait another 4? What makes now the time? My grandfather knocked 3 times on the arm of his wheelchair. We understood. Now was when my grandfather was weak, when he was vulnerable. Another 3 distinct knocks echoed from the front door. Thomas and I grabbed our guns and followed my grandpa as he rolled over to answer. "Officer," he said, "what brings you here?" My grandmother brought the grizzled Alaskan state trooper a mug of hot coffee to match my grandfather's. His name was A.P. Cartwright. He must have been the 3rd trooper the other 2 told me about. I retained a sense of skepticism, given his colleagues' level of professionalism, but it slowly wore away as he talked. He spoke with an honest and serious cadence that reassured me that perhaps we had at least one ally. And that's when I arrived at the motel. I saw the pickup in the parking lot. Its tires were slashed, and I went into the room with the busted door. "Did you get my laptop?" I asked. "Or my phone?" He shook his head. "All that was left was this." He pulled something from his bag and set it on the table. The 2 plastic pieces of VHS tape I had disassembled. "We went back to the station to see if those bozos knew anything about it. Said you came by earlier. Said they took down your name and number, so I called. Some feller answered in Russian. Hung up when I identified myself. Couldn't contact you, but I recognized the last name, so I chased that lead over here, and that's that." Grandpa brought the tape closer to him for a better look. He chuckled to himself. "What's the joke?" asked the officer. My grandfather hesitated. Grandma placed her hand on his head, ruffling his gray hair. "I guess it's time," he said. "I'll be incriminating myself, but at least we'll all be on the same page. Maybe I can finally make my family safe. This writing says the red tape. Yeah, I translated it," I added. "But what use is just describing the VHS? No. The red tape doesn't refer to this VHS. The red tape was the name of the smuggling group. It refers to the bureaucratic red tape that kept the Soviet citizens restricted from simple entertainment and other liberties. It was meant to remind them why they'd started the group. Now the hunter uses it to remind me, to make sure I don't forget." "What group?" Cartwright inquired. "What hunter?" He told the man everything. He told him about the hunter. He told him about the incident and about everything since. Cartwright jotted it all down in his notepad. He asked questions when he could to clarify. The more the scratching of the pencil to parchment continued, the more sure I was that A.P. Cartwright might be our saving grace. "I moved here from Anchorage over 25 years ago," said the trooper. "This is a quiet place, not much to do, except for a few years in, when a murder took place on the outskirts of town. Few days passed but no leads. Trucker wasn't local, didn't have any connections in town, and no reasonable enemies." Isabel grabbed my hand. It was a gesture the officer noticed from his periphery. He understood. It stumped me until a couple of days later I responded to a call about a red VHS tape. A dead trucker and a man in a wooden mask. That was the 3 of you, wasn't it? We nodded solemnly. Cartwright shifted his attention back to his coffee and his cupped hands. He had a wife. The trucker, that is. I remember the way she cried when I called her. The sound of a heart shattering in a million pieces. For a long time afterwards, she called the station. Every day. And I answered. Every day. "Have you found the killer? Have you found him? Have you found him?" He stopped speaking. He stared into the black of the coffee. I witnessed the ever so slight quiver of his lip before he continued. "She didn't make it long. A few months in, she hadn't been making her usual calls to the station. Tried to get a hold of her, but it was pills. That's what she chose." No sound filled the room. A silence only broken from the faintest creak of an old shifting house. "The hunter is a bastard," my grandpa said after a while. "Doesn't care who he hurts. He'll keep going unless we stop him." After a sip of black coffee, the grizzled vet said, "If what you're saying is true, then I'm with you. We're gonna put that son of a bitch down." Elation. That's the only way to describe how I felt. Finally, we had someone who could really help Someone who wasn't past his prime, bound to a wheelchair. Someone who wasn't completely out of their wheelhouse like the three of us. "But how do we find him?" Isabel asked. "The message!" I shouted. I remembered something my grandfather had failed to tell the trooper. Inside the VHS this time, there was this USB drive. I fished it from my pocket. Thankfully, at the very least, I managed to secure one thing of importance. "What did it say?" Cartwright inquired. It was the original tape. Only this time, he spliced new footage at the end of him talking to my grandfather. At first it was in Russian. I turned to my grandfather. "Can you understand Russian?" "Been working with them since the Reagan era, child. Of course I do." He chuckled. He turned to my grandma and said, "Sweetheart, would you grab the laptop so we can take a look?" "No," Thomas interjected, catching everyone's attention. "I mean, not here. You said you put in your laptop at the motel, right? Then by coincidence, the hunter shows up. How are we so sure that's not how we tracked you there?" I thought it over for a moment. I hadn't considered that, as stupid as it sounded. He could have just seen my truck out front. Maybe, but maybe he used it to find you. All I'm saying is maybe it would be better to watch it somewhere safer and more secure. "To the station then," Cartwright said. "Smart thinking, son." We got into two separate cars. Thomas drove Grandma and Grandpa in their wheelchair-accessible van. Isabel and I rode with Cartwright in his Alaskan State Trooper SUV. "You said the man who answered the phone spoke in Russian, right?" asked Isabel from the back seat. The trooper nodded. "That means at the very least, he pocketed your phone for a while." "Yeah, I'm sure he wanted Grandpa to call me. That way they could talk or whatever." As I stared out the window to the trees, and as dark, heavy clouds moved in, so similar to that afternoon so long ago, Isabel asked the question which brought us one step closer to finding our man. "Did you leave your location on?" If you enjoyed that horror story, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And click one of the videos here if you want to see the previous parts of the story. And as usual, I'll see you again next time. You have a creepy evening.